Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into something that might seem a little, quiet at first. We're going to be talking about the danger of complacency. But believe me, it's more interesting than it sounds. And we'll be looking at this specifically through the lens of the Baha'i faith, drawing wisdom from the writings of Shoghi Effendi.
What I think is so interesting about Shoghi Effendi's perspective is that he doesn't just define complacency. He really digs into its psychological roots and its consequences for society. And best of all, he offers us ways to overcome it.
Okay, so I think a good place to start would be with something we can all relate to. You ever get that feeling where you just keep putting off a task? Even though, deep down, you know it needs to get done. Or maybe you've been part of a group project and everyone just assumed someone else would take charge, and then nothing happens.
Exactly. I mean, those are such classic examples of complacency, right? That's complacency creeping in. It's that sneaky feeling of being satisfied with how things are, even when they're not really working for us. And Shoghi Effendi warns us that this can be a really dangerous thing, especially for a growing global community like the Baha'i faith.
So it's not just about being lazy. It can actually, hinder the progress of a whole community. Wow, that's pretty intense when you think about it.
It really is. You know, when individuals in a community become complacent, they stop actively contributing. They kind of stop trying to excel and they just settle for good enough. And what happens is the collective energy just fades away. And that community's potential for growth is stifled.
That idea of complacency affecting groups, does that resonate with anything you've seen outside the Baha'i faith, like in social movements or even companies,
Absolutely. It happens all the time. In sociology, there's this phenomenon called movement fatigue. It's basically what happens when that initial energy that fuels a movement starts to fade. And people kind of just assume that progress will continue on autopilot.
Oh, I see what you mean. So complacency can lead to the decline of movements then? That's kind of scary.
It can, yeah. We see it happening throughout history, over and over again. Think about social movements that start with a ton of energy, but then they fizzle out because people get complacent. They assume the changes they fought for are just going to stick around, no problem. Or think about organizations that used to be super innovative. Then slowly, they become less and less interesting because a culture of complacency sets in.
Wow, that is fascinating. And you mentioned there's a psychological component to this as well.
For sure. There are two key psychological factors that really come into play here: status quo bias and diffusion of responsibility. Status quo bias is that human tendency to prefer things the way they are, even if they're not great. It's just because change feels uncomfortable or risky.
It's like sticking with what's familiar, even if it's not working, because at least it feels safe. I think we've all been there.
Oh, totally. We have. And then there's diffusion of responsibility. That happens when we're in a group and everyone just assumes that someone else will take care of a problem, and then what happens? No one does anything.
Oh my gosh, that is so relatable. I've definitely been in those situations where I think, oh, surely someone else has got this covered. And yeah, sometimes it turns out no one did.
It's a trap we all fall into. But the good news is that once we understand how these things work, we can start to come up with ways to deal with them.
Okay, so we've talked about what complacency is. But what about Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith? Where does he fit into all of this? What did he have to say about it?
Well, Shoghi Effendi was very concerned about the dangers of complacency within the Baha'i community. He saw it as something subtle, but also powerful, something that could really undermine the progress of the faith. In one of his letters, he writes, "The progress of this divine cause depends not so much upon the exertions of the Baha'i teacher as upon the spiritual receptiveness of his hearer. Yet it is the duty of every believer to offer the message."
That's interesting. It seems like he's highlighting a kind of tension there, right? Like, on the one hand, it's not about forcing the Baha'i message on others.
But on the other hand, it's not an excuse to just sit back and do nothing either. He makes it very clear that every believer has a duty to offer the message, even if the outcome is out of our hands.
So how do we find that balance? How do we balance the idea that we can't force acceptance, but we do have to take action? That's a tough one.
It is, yeah. And it's a question that Shoghi Effendi actually helps us figure out. He doesn't just leave us hanging with this tension. He offers a way to navigate it.
Okay, now I'm really curious to hear more. How does he suggest we approach this?
Well, he points to two key concepts that help us reconcile these ideas: divine agency and human responsibility.
Okay, let's break those down a little bit. Sometimes those concepts can be a little, abstract.
Absolutely. So when we talk about divine agency, what we're acknowledging is that ultimately God has a plan. Whether someone accepts the Baha'i teachings or not isn't totally up to us. It's recognizing that we can't force anyone to believe something.
So it's about humility, like acknowledging that we're not in total control and trusting that there's a bigger process at work.
Exactly. But, and this is where human responsibility comes in, that doesn't mean we should just sit around and wait. Shoghi Effendi reminds us that we have a duty to act, to share the message, to create the right conditions for spiritual receptivity.
So it's like we can't control the outcome, but we do have to plant the seeds.
Exactly. You can think of it like a gardener. A gardener carefully prepares the soil and sows the seeds. They make sure the plants have enough water and sunlight. But at the end of the day, they can't force the plants to grow. They have to trust in the natural process.
That's a great analogy. It really helps to see how those two concepts, divine agency and human responsibility, work together.
Yeah, and this is where complacency becomes so dangerous. It can lead us to extremes, like, on the one hand, trying to force outcomes, which never really works, or on the other hand, just giving up and not doing anything at all.
So finding that balance, that sweet spot between effort and acceptance, that's the key.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be talking about more as we go deeper into this topic. We'll explore how Shoghi Effendi's ideas and some psychological principles can help us navigate this and overcome complacency.
I'm ready to dive in. I'm already thinking about some areas of my own life where I might be falling into some of these complacency traps. I bet our listeners are starting to think about it too.
I'm sure they are. It's something that we all deal with, no matter who we are or what we believe. We all face these moments of complacency, and it's by understanding them that we can learn to move past them.
All right, so let's move on to the next stage of our deep dive. We've talked about what complacency is, but now I'm curious to explore the consequences. What are the real-world impacts of complacency, both for individuals and for communities? This is where I think things are going to get really interesting.
You're right. This is where we see how complacency can become a real problem. It's not just about feeling stuck. It can really impact our spiritual growth and our relationships. It can even affect our sense of purpose.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What are some of the impacts of complacency on individuals? How does it show up in our lives?
Well, one thing is that complacency can lead to spiritual stagnation. When we get too comfortable, we stop pushing ourselves. We stop trying to deepen our understanding, challenge what we think we know, or grow. And the Baha'i writings talk about this a lot.
What kind of warnings do they give? I'm always interested in how spiritual teachings address these very human tendencies.
Bahá'u'lláh, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, has a powerful statement about this. He said, "Should a man wish to glory in himself, he should behold his helplessness and acknowledge the glory of God."
Wow, that's a really profound quote. What do you think the main message is there?
Well, I think it's reminding us that to really grow spiritually, we need to be humble. Complacency, on the other hand, can make us think we have it all figured out. It can make us attached to our own limited understanding. We stop searching for deeper truths.
So it's like we're so focused on what we've already done that we forget to look at the bigger picture. We forget about the endless possibilities for growth and discovery that are still out there.
Exactly. And this stagnation doesn't just affect our spiritual lives either. It spills over into other areas too. Our relationships might suffer because we're not putting in the effort to connect with others on a deeper level. We might feel unfulfilled or lose our motivation because we've lost sight of our bigger goals.
So complacency has a ripple effect, like it affects our inner lives and our outward actions. It's almost like a gradual erosion of our potential.
I like that. It's a great way to put it. And it doesn't just happen individually either. It can happen to whole communities. Remember that idea of movement fatigue we were talking about? That's a perfect example of how complacency can creep into a group and weaken its collective action.
How does that work in a community setting? What are some signs that complacency is setting in?
One of the clearest signs is a decline in participation. People might still show up, but they're not going above and beyond. They're not bringing their full energy or enthusiasm.
It's like when you're working on a group project and some people are totally invested while others are just doing the bare minimum.
Exactly. And that uneven effort can really drag the whole group down. Another sign is a lack of new ideas. When people are complacent, they stop questioning how things are done. They stop looking for better ways. This can cause the community to stagnate and feel like it's not moving forward.
So complacency creates an atmosphere where people are just going through the motions. They're not really engaged or excited about what they're doing. And over time, that really drains the energy out of a community.
Absolutely. And this isn't just theoretical, by the way. Shoghi Effendi wrote specifically about the danger of complacency in the Baha'i community. He warned against becoming too attached to routines and structures. He encouraged Baha'is to constantly strive for excellence and be actively involved in building a better world.
So he saw complacency as a real threat to the progress of the Baha'i faith.
He did. He knew that complacency could lead to a kind of spiritual inertia. Individuals and communities lose their purpose and their drive. He was always reminding Baha'is to stay aware, to resist settling for mediocrity, and to live up to their full potential.
That's powerful, and I think it goes beyond just the Baha'i faith, too. All of us, no matter our beliefs, face complacency in our lives.
That's so true. This is a universal human tendency. And what's great is that the Baha'i writings offer guidance that can help all of us. They remind us that growth takes effort, that progress requires us to step outside of our comfort zones, and that complacency can really hold us back from reaching our full potential.
All right, so we know complacency is a problem, but what about the other side of the coin? What are some antidotes to complacency? What can we use to overcome it and move forward with purpose and energy? This is where I start to feel hopeful.
Me too. The good news is that we're not helpless against complacency. We have the power to choose, and the Baha'i teachings and psychology give us practical ways to fight back.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those strategies? Where do we even begin?
Well, one of the most important things we can do is cultivate a sense of self-efficacy.
Self-efficacy. I'm not sure I know what that means.
Self-efficacy is basically the belief in our ability to make a difference. It's that confidence that tells us, I can do this.
Okay, I get it. So if we don't have self-efficacy, we're more likely to become complacent because we don't think we can change things.
Exactly. And the Baha'i teachings help us here. They remind us of our potential, our capacity to grow, and our ability to contribute to making the world a better place. Shoghi Effendi often used the image of the pearl of great price to describe the Baha'i teachings. He said that everyone has the potential to find this precious jewel within themselves.
That's beautiful. It suggests that we all have something valuable to offer, that we're all capable of making a difference.
Exactly. And believing in ourselves is so important for overcoming complacency. When we see ourselves as agents of change, we're less likely to just accept things as they are. We're more likely to step up, take initiative, and share our unique talents with the world.
So self-efficacy is like the fuel that drives us to take action.
I love that analogy. It really gets at the heart of what self-efficacy is all about, and the Baha'i teachings offer us practical ways to develop that confidence. For example, deepening our understanding of the writings, reflecting on what they mean, and putting those principles into practice can help us develop a strong sense of purpose.
So it's not just reading the text passively, it's about engaging with them, understanding their wisdom, and letting them guide our actions.
Exactly. And that process of reflection and application can be really empowering. It helps us connect to a bigger purpose and see ourselves as part of a larger story of progress.
And having a sense of purpose is another key part of overcoming complacency, right?
You got it. When we know why we're doing something, when we have a why driving us, we're much less likely to get stuck in inertia or apathy. The Baha'i teachings offer a really strong sense of purpose. They invite us to see ourselves as contributing to the advancement of civilization, as people who are building a more just and unified world.
So our actions aren't just about us then. They're about something much bigger than ourselves.
Right. And that kind of perspective can be so motivating. It helps us see the value in what we're doing, even when our efforts feel small.
Okay, so we've got two key ingredients, self-efficacy and purpose. But those are still pretty big concepts. What are some more practical steps we can take to fight complacency in our everyday lives?
That's a great question, because while those bigger ideas are important, we need to be able to put them into practice. So let's dive into some concrete strategies, shall we?
Let's do it. I'm ready to get practical.
Okay, so let's talk about some practical steps.
Perfect. I'm thinking about our listeners out there, maybe going for a walk or doing the dishes. They're ready to take action. Where do we begin?
One of the best strategies, and this comes straight from the Baha'i teachings, is to set clear, measurable goals. Instead of having these big, vague hopes, break them down into smaller, more achievable steps.
So like instead of saying, I want to be more involved in my community, I could set a goal to go to one community event a month. Or volunteer for a specific project.
Exactly. Make those hopes concrete and turn them into actions. And then, as you achieve each of those smaller goals, it builds momentum, and it reinforces that sense of self-efficacy that we talked about.
Right. It's like that saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Breaking things down into smaller chunks just makes them feel less overwhelming.
Absolutely. Another really powerful tool is to find some accountability partners. Having people in your life who share your goals, who can support you and encourage you, can make a huge difference.
It's like having a team of cheerleaders, but also like people who will give you a little nudge if you start to slip back into complacency.
Exactly. It's about surrounding yourself with support, people who encourage you to be your best and remind you that you're not alone. And these accountability partners can be anyone, people in your community, friends, even people you meet online. There are so many ways to connect with people who share your goals nowadays.
That's so true. I think sometimes just having someone to talk to about your goals, someone who gets it, someone to share your struggles and your successes with, that can be so motivating.
It really is. You know, another practice I found helpful for combating complacency is drawing inspiration from exemplars. The Baha'i faith has so many stories of people who overcame huge challenges, people who dedicated their lives to service and really embodied the principles we're talking about.
You mean like reading about the lives of the early Baha'is? Or studying the sacrifices made by Bahá'u'lláh and his family?
Exactly. But it's more than just reading about them. It's about thinking about their stories, asking yourself, what qualities did they embody? What choices did they make? What obstacles did they face? And then think about how you can apply those lessons in your own life.
It's like finding role models, but on a much deeper level. Really digging into their stories and letting their actions inspire us.
Exactly. It's about internalizing their strength, their dedication, and their commitment to their beliefs. And when you do that, it can really breathe new life into your own efforts.
I love that. It's like we're tapping into a constant source of strength and motivation that's always there for us.
It is. And speaking of inspiring stories, there's one in the source material about a Baha'i who was hesitant to share their faith with a coworker.
Oh, I remember that story. It's a perfect example of how even small acts of courage can have a ripple effect, right?
Exactly. Do you want to share it with our listeners?
Yeah, okay. So this Baha'i was a little nervous to bring up their beliefs in a conversation with a colleague. They weren't sure how the colleague would react, and they didn't want to seem pushy. But then the topic came up naturally in their conversation. And even though they were hesitant, they just went for it. They shared a little about their faith, focusing on the ideas of unity, justice, and peace. And guess what?
What happened? Tell me.
The colleague was totally open to it. They wanted to know more, and that first conversation led to a bunch more about the Baha'i faith. Now, the story doesn't say whether or not the colleague ended up becoming a Baha'i, but that's not the point, is it?
No, not at all. What's important is that this Baha'i took a chance, stepped out of their comfort zone, and it had an impact. They could have easily let complacency win, but they chose to act. And by doing that, they opened up a possibility, a connection that might never have existed otherwise.
Wow, that is powerful. It reminds me of what Shoghi Effendi said about how the outcome is up to God, but the effort has to come from us. It's like a reminder that we don't need to wait for huge opportunities to make a difference. We can start right now with the people around us every day, just by being open to those little moments of connection.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the main idea of today's deep dive. Complacency is dangerous, but we can beat it. It takes effort and a willingness to push ourselves beyond what feels comfortable. It takes a commitment to living our lives with purpose and working towards our highest goals.
And I think that Bahá'u'lláh quote you shared earlier really sums up that call to action. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we should be deeply concerned with the needs of the world around us. We should focus our energy on what needs to be done right now.
That is a powerful message. It's calling us to engage with the world, to understand what needs to change, and to be part of the solution. We can't just sit back and be complacent when there's so much to do.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what's the main thing you hope our listeners will take away from this?
I think the most important thing is this. You have the power to overcome complacency. The tools and the guidance are out there. The inspiration is there too. All you have to do is use them. Take on the challenge, take action, and use your unique gifts to make the world a better place.
That's beautifully put. And I'll just add that even the smallest effort can make a big difference. Every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every moment of reflection, all of it matters. So go out there and be the change you want to see in the world.
And until we meet again, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep striving to live a life full of purpose and service.
See you in the next deep dive.